And welcome everybody to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I am your host, Chief Cat Herder, and MC for this hour. I'm very glad to see and hear all of you here today. Let me begin by introducing the forum, where it comes from, how it works, and who supports it. And then we introduce our guest, and we can get started. So to begin with, the Future Trends Forum is the video discussion spinoff from the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. Tara, if you could push to the next slide, please. That's a monthly report, a trends analysis that takes a look at current developments in education and technology. It's been looking at these for a little more than 5 years, with nearly 100 trends that we're following. So this gives us some longitudinal information for trying to understand the forces reshaping education and technology. If you haven't seen it before, go to ftte.us, download a couple of recent copies, sign up. In fact, the most recent one came out just a few days ago. Now, if you want to take a look at this chart, this will just give you a quick overview of just how many trends we follow. And you can see that some of them are about education itself, some of them are about the forces around education, some of them are about technology per se, that's on the right edge of the screen, and some of the intersection of technology and education overlap. Combined, these sometimes overlap into the mega trend of what's called the higher education crisis. So this is kind of a top-level overview of the forces acting on higher education. So this will give you a sense of each of the tracks. Now, beyond this, it's really important to know, if we go to the next slide, please, Dan, that when we have these kind of conversations, that we don't just look at one particular region or nation, but these conversations are global. So this is something we track in the FTD report, and this is one of the ways that our conversation here exists. As you can see from this map, we've had sign-ins from almost every continent in the world. And I've presented from at least 2. So it's really important that we think not locally, but globally, especially as these forces begin to reshape society. Now, to go further, let me just tell you about how this gets supported, and we thank some of our sponsors. To begin with, NicerNet, a nonprofit in New York State that helps that state's colleges, universities, libraries, and museums connect high-speed broadband. We're very grateful to them for their support. And we're also grateful to Shindig, because as you can see, Shindig makes this technology work. And let me just take a minute to show you how different features function. Where I am, and where just for a minute more, you can see a little slide. This is the stage. Everybody who's here can hear and see us on stage. And any of you who have a working mic and camera can join us on stage as well. Below us is what I think of as the audience or the participants swarm. And you can see right now dozens of people, either represented by a black silhouette, by a static picture, or by a moving video. So right now, for example, you can take a look at Paul B. with his fancy headphones, who was probably shocked that I'm calling him out. You can see all those different people. And if you want to connect with one other person on a person-to-person basis, simply double-click on their icon. If the person's up for talking, your 2 icons will click together. You'll have your own private audio-visual bubble where you can talk. Now, this is a forum that's dedicated to conversation and discussion. So we want to maximize the number of channels we have in order to share your thoughts and to get feedback. So let me just show you the 3 big ones. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, there's a white strip that runs along, and that has several different key buttons to click. So if you look on the left edge of it, the second to left is a little kind of dialogue box like from the comic strip or a cartoon. If you click that, up will pop a text chat box, and that will allow you to chat with the nearest roughly 18 or so people who've signed in with you. And right now, I can see Tom Hames from Houston, Vanessa Vale from Yuma, Colorado, Fred Bashir from, I think, Seattle, Robin Hanson from the DC area, Chris Kirby from about 3 rooms away from me right now, and so on. So that's one way. It's easy to do with monitoring the chat boxes. Now, if you'd like to ask a question for everyone to see, simply click on that little icon that has a kind of question mark. If you click that, type in a question, we'll flash it on the screen so everyone can see it. And I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it. Now, if your mic is working, if your camera is working, if your broadband is okay, and if you're in a space where you can talk out loud, try clicking on that raised hand icon. That tells us you want to join us up here on stage. And right now, we can fit about 4 different logins at the same time up here. So if you have a question or comment, click that, we'll beam you up on stage, and you can talk to the guest and myself and everybody at once. That sounds complicated. It's actually really easy to do. And meanwhile, if you're on Twitter, just use the hashtag FTTE, We'll be tracking that, and you'll see all kinds of comments and questions. Now, there's one other source of support that makes the whole Future Transform enterprise work, and that's you, some of you, on Patreon. If you haven't seen it, Patreon is a crowdfunding organization, much like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. The way it works is you agree to sign up to support a creative person as they work. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you'll see dozens of people that have signed up to contribute as little as $1 a month just to keep all the lights running and the technology humming and the people here for this kind of project. I'd really appreciate it if you can support us in any way you can. It's really the only way we can do this. So we have 3 sets of sponsors. We have technology, we have conversation, and on top of that, we now have a guest. Let me welcome Robin Hanson. If you don't know Robin, he is an extraordinary thinker. He's professionally an economist at George Mason University. When I say the DC area, I'm in northeastern Virginia. He's also someone who's deeply, deeply steeped in technology, who has worked in the technology field and continues to work in the technology field. So he's right there at the intersection where economics and technology overlap and influence each other. He's the author of an extraordinary book called The Age of M, about one-way automation and AI could go in terms of human emulation. He's finished a new book, which is due out, I think, January, about how humans actually interact with each other. He's one of the most extraordinary thinkers I've met in years. A torrent of ideas, razor-sharp mind. I'm just delighted to have him on the forum. So please, let's knock these PowerPoint slides off the stage and bring our human being up. Now we need some kind of special drum roll. We need a special effect. Maybe Star Trek beaming noise, or maybe a drum roll. Ride of the Valkyries. Let's see how it goes. Robin, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, welcome very much to the forum. I'm glad to see you.
I'm looking forward.
Let me just, in order to begin, can you just tell us what you're working on right now as an economist? And when I say work, I mean both what you're teaching and what you're researching.
Well, as you may know, most professors don't have that much choice over what they teach. They teach whatever classes are left over that need teaching. So I'm teaching law and economics at the moment.
Law and economics.
Yes, I've been teaching that for many years. It's a fun subject because it's full of lots of simple concepts with broad application. And instead of getting lost in math or complicated analysis, it's applying very basic concepts. And I enjoy that. In research, I've been, marketing the 2 books. One that came out a little over a year ago, the other's coming out in January, and then I have a grant from the Open Philanthropy Foundation to study a variation on the scenario that I'll describe in my book. So maybe we can get to that when we talk about the book.
Excellent. Congratulations on the grant. Very good. Well, in order to begin, let me just remind everybody that I have a battery of questions with which I will torment our poor guest. But as he speaks and as you think and reflect, you will have your own questions as well as your own comments. Maybe you'll have howls of outrage. Maybe you'll have jubilations of support. But remember, use those 3 different communication means in order to share your thoughts. So to begin with, let me just ask, The Age of M is one of the strangest and most stimulating books I've read in a long time. Friends, if you haven't read it, the idea is that the combination, that will basically have an artificial life form which emulates human beings, hence the name M. And Robin outlines these in exquisite detail, looking at the ways that M economics could work, planetary redesign, relationships, psychology, religion, politics. It's quite an extraordinary work. I'm curious, since that's come out, what kind of reactions do you get to that now? Do people fear this possible success for the human race? Do they think it's implausible? Do they think you've totally missed something very important? What kind of reactions do you get?
Well, I actually get pretty much the range of reactions I expected because I actually asked for a pretty wide range of feedback before the book came out. So I had a lot of people commenting on the book draft. But the range of expectations are relatively straightforward. Many people will just deny my assumptions, which is fine. So the key idea of the book is I take a certain set of very common assumptions and I try to work out the consequences in great detail for the main purpose of just showing it's possible to work out consequences of a particular set of assumptions. Many people tend to assume that's impossible. I get some people who see it as an axiom that the future is unforeseeable and they therefore declare I must be doing something wrong because you couldn't possibly know what would be the consequences of things. For them, it's some sense of free will versus determinism or the impossibility of social science, but they just think one could not possibly know what would happen. And I'm trying to write this book to prove that wrong. But of course, if it's an axiom for you, that can't go wrong. Many people, as I said, will just deny the assumptions that they say, well, yes, that could happen, but I think some other scenario is more likely, and therefore I'm not interested in your scenario because I'm only interested in the scenario I find most likely.
What kind of scenarios do they push?
Well, some people are involved in artificial intelligence, research and speculation, and they think other forms of artificial intelligence are likely to come first. And again, I have this new project where I am analyzing a different scenario in that direction. So this is a very particular form of robot that I'm analyzing. Some people will say that I shouldn't be so cynical to describe what's likely to happen if we did the least to avoid it. I should be more moralistic and praise or preach about what should happen. That's the proper role of a futurist, is to preach and inspire or warn, as opposed to just try to give the most neutral estimate of what's likely to happen.
That's interesting. I get a lot of that myself. Where people want, well, they'll go either way. If I'm too neutral, they'll say I'm not moralistic enough. If I suggest something could happen, they think I'm thinking it should happen, and so
right.
Well, when we talk about automation in general, I mean, you've hit on all kinds of problems that crop up. I'm curious, one of the, I don't want to say objections to automation, but one of the forms of criticism that we currently get is that automation is conducted not neutrally but by scientists, but by enormous companies largely that have bad models for human interactions and are not good corporate players in the economic environment. How do you see that happening? Do you think, for example, Facebook could force M's down our throats as perhaps VR chatbots that we will have to interact with instead of people? Or will Apple give us vegan turtleneck wearing IMs or what?
Well, so for the larger question of just the general trend of automation outside the context of my specific book, I would say that automation in the next 20 years or even half centuries is likely to continue to show the same patterns it has over the last century or two. We're not necessarily about some threat, big point where suddenly things are going to change dramatically. We have seen vast amounts of automation and improved technology for a long time, and it has almost always been dominated by corporations doing it for profit. That's the trend you've seen so far. That has good and bad consequences, but you've seen roughly the mix of consequences overall, and that's the range of consequences you should roughly expect in the next 20 years or so. You should expect that continued degree of consequences. Yes, the firms will tend to create products and services through automation that they can sell for money. They will neglect things that you could just do on your own time for free. They will be less encouraging you to sit and meditate, for example, or to smell the flowers. That they can't charge much for that. So they will be inventing technologies to suck you in and watch their screens and pay for products, et cetera. That's what industry has been doing for centuries, and it'll continue to do that. If you want innovation in the kinds of things that people don't pay for, you'll have to try to induce that in some other way. And that can be hard.
Well, looking at the past century is pretty bold. That goes against some of the ideas that we are experiencing some break into the new, that this is something we haven't seen before.
Right. I think that's one of the key mistakes people are making is that, and I made this mistake, I have to admit, long ago. So I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago from 1981 to 84. And at that point, that was the birth of an AI boom at the time. There were lots of articles in the media and claims about a great innovation coming soon in AI. And I found that plausible. And I left school and went off to Silicon Valley to work in artificial intelligence for a while, which I did for 9 years. And that was in part because I was a young, naive 20-year-old who bought the hype. And part of the way this hype goes is happening now and then, which is you say, look at this demo. No one was ever able to do that before. We must be really close to something big. But if you think about it, that's the way it's been every decade for a very long time. There's always been a new thing that we've never been able to do before, and it's exciting and interesting. The question is, does this mean suddenly we're almost there able to do everything, or is just one more step on a long path? And I've got to say, it's pretty obvious now today, even though we've had some dramatic improvements in the last 10 years, we're still more steps along a long path, and there's not obviously any acceleration other than a burst of interest. But we have these waves of interest. They go up and down roughly every decade or two. And that's been going on for many long time, a century at least.
Yeah.
And we see the consistent pattern of boom of interest, boom of investment, hand-wringing concern, official committees and panels and discussions, news articles, and then the hype doesn't pan out, interest fades away, attention turns to other things, but then another decade comes back. That's what you should continue to expect for a while.
That's really, really powerful advice, everybody. It's you can go back. What year was it that the Johnson administration published that paper on cybernation? Was it 1965?
In the 60s, there were a number of big prominent committees and articles in the New York Times, and there were presidents addressing the subject during the 1960s.
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering my question. This gives us, it's a contentious point, but I think studying history gives us a superb way of looking into the future. We have a question coming up from Tom Hames in just a second. Trying to figure out by which channel he would deliver these questions. In the meantime, friends, we just remind you all to jump in. If you haven't had a chance to read Robin's book, again, I strongly recommend it. I've also linked before to a talk he gave at Google about EMS, which is a splendid talk, really.
I have a 12-minute TED talk if you want the polished TED version.
Oh, the condensed, boiled down version.
Yeah, slick.
Yeah, very good, very good. And pretty soon we can automate that. That's what I'm expecting. Cool. Okay, well, we've got we have Tom. Let's see if we can bring him up on stage. Tom Hames is coming to you from Houston, Texas, where hopefully he is drier. Again, the dramatic transition to beaming.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my question was disruption versus corporate control, and you talked about that a minute ago. What kind of is it still possible that the internet will fulfill its disruptive capacity and allow people to access information, empower themselves in a way that undermines the monoliths, so to speak? Or are you firmly in the camp of we're all basically screwed to be slaves of Facebook? So
neither, I would say.
Yeah.
Look,
okay.
We are in the industrial world. It's been going on for a century or two. We see roughly what the industrial world looks like. It's not changing that much. The industrial world is dominated to a substantial degree by large organizations, especially large for-profit firms. That's been the nature of the industrial world for a while. Wherever new technologies appear, they eventually tend to become influenced substantially or even controlled and dominated by these large organizations. Sometimes they end up being large government organizations, but more often they are large private organizations. It's just really hard for us people in the modern era to do anything on a large scale with large scale coordination without coordinating it through these large organizations. That's just pretty much how it's always gone. Sometimes we have moderate exceptions, like something like Wikipedia or something, but even that is arguably now a large organization. It's a nonprofit organization, but it's definitely a structured organization. There's definitely authority there. It's not in everybody's equal world. And that's pretty much what you should expect for the indefinite future, no matter what technologies show up. That's the world we live in.
No, I'm not suggesting a communist future or anything like that. But I sometimes wonder if we are sometimes colored by this industrial mindset that this is the way it is, that you're going to have the General Motors and the U.S. Steels of the world, and that is no longer as relevant. I mean, those companies have all fallen by the wayside. And it wouldn't, we've had the rise of new companies like Apple and Facebook and Amazon and so on and so forth. But you wonder how hard it would be for people to move beyond those companies. And the reason Facebook is the way it is because that's where the conversation is. But if people suddenly decide they want to have a conversation somewhere else, Facebook's going to be in trouble very quickly. I mean, there's no hard giant industrial concern holding them in place.
The median duration of large and small companies in the world today in the U.S. is roughly 15 years. So the particular companies are quite likely to go away. And they have. If you look at the biggest companies of 50 years ago, very few of them are still substantially large today. So you should definitely expect a changing mix of which big organizations and companies are dominating. But the mere fact that large organizations will dominate, you should probably expect that to continue. But there'd be new firms, new names, new products.
Did you see the new Blade Runner movie?
I did.
Yes.
Twice.
Yeah, but
It's excellent.
without any spoilers, I just say one of the fun thing about it was seeing some of the old logos of Pan Am, Atari,
Yeah.
and even the USSR.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting sign of the century past.
I don't disagree
Please
with
go
your
ahead.
point. I said I don't disagree with your point that the large organizations will dominate. I think one of the questions is each one of these organizations comes with a certain philosophy that drives it, a design philosophy that drives it. And you can see those colorations and the differences between the way Apple operates versus Facebook versus Google. And as we have this turnover in those organizations, if that's happening rapidly, we can basically change philosophies like we change hats in some ways in a virtual world, which wasn't really that easy to do in the world of 50 or 100 years ago. So I think that's kind of an interesting shift that is a little different from the industrial world. But I don't disagree with your main point. People like to go with the familiar. They're going to go with the large. Everybody goes to McDonald's and dies of food poisoning. So
Enjoys a tasty burger.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that last point there.
Watch
Tom.
the founder.
I did. It was good.
Before we suffer so terribly, let me just again remind everybody that you can see how easy it was to teleport Tom on stage and join us, and we should have more questions. Robin, don't go away, Tom. Robin, go away. I have a question from a guest who couldn't make it right now because he was on a plane. But he asked a question about von Neumann machines, or that's my translation of it. He says, does Dr. Hanson see a future where robots are designing and building other robots? What do you think?
That's the main robot world worth thinking about, honestly.
Yeah.
That is, today we have robots of various sorts and they have various capabilities, but honestly, they contribute a pretty small fraction to overall economic product and growth. Mostly it's humans doing the main intellectual heavy lifting and robots are helping on the margin. Someday we can plausibly imagine robots basically doing most of the work and humans, like ourselves at least, being on the margin. And that's when it's a robot world. And that's the kind of robot world we're thinking about, I think, mainly. That before then, it's a lot like our world. Even if we have much better robots, as long as they're mainly on the margins, mostly doing the things we humans can't do, and most of the income that's earned by anybody is earned by the humans doing jobs. It's mostly a world that looks like the world you see around you, growing at roughly the same rate, with similar distribution of, inequality and tasks, etc. But once robots can do most everything, the economy changes quite dramatically, and it's worth noticing and thinking about what those changes would be. And that's my book is about a world like that, where the robots basically do most everything.
And they succeed us. If I could, and this is always a risky question, but thinking about history, thinking about incremental change, when do you think we cross over from robots being marginal or minority of task performing to when they become the majority of labor force?
So I think it depends on which of several key scenarios happen. So I can give my probabilities for them, but you might not trust my probabilities so much, but you might want to know which scenarios to be thinking in terms of.
Please.
The most plausible scenario, and perhaps the highest probability, if you will, is just that we continue as we have for the last 70 years, slowly accumulating better software with cheaper hardware, et cetera, slowly switching which jobs are done by people versus computers. The rate of that displacement has been slow and relatively steady for a long time. And I've actually been in the habit of asking AI researchers that I meet who have been in the field for at least 20 years, how far have we come in your field in the last 20 years as a percentage of the distance to human level abilities? And they tell me 5 to 10%. And at that rate, it would take 2 to 4 centuries for the typical field to reach human level abilities. And so if no dramatic revolution or innovation comes, that would be my prediction, is it takes 2 to 4 centuries until eventually the typical job is done by a machine relative to a human. That would be more the crossover point there. But there are the possibility of revolutions. Some people are thinking that recent technology and deep learning, or et cetera, show that there's about to be big revolutions that will dramatically accelerate the rate at which technology improves in this area, and therefore it'll take much less than 2 to 4 centuries, perhaps only 20 years. I'm skeptical about those revolutions, but you should, consider them possible. My book is based on a different sort of revolution, in a sense, the kind that we could anticipate, but it's still a revolution in the sense that it's a technology that's not really very useful until it reaches a threshold, and then all of a sudden it's really, really useful. And that's the technology of a brain emulation. That is, you take a real human brain of a real person and you scan it and find spatial and chemical detail. You see exactly what's where, connected to what of what type, and then you make a computer model that works that way. And if you do that and it kind of like the thing, but not really very much, it's really worthless. But once you get to the point where it's actually a faithful model enough that it has the same input-output behavior, now that's worth trillions. At least if you can put it in cheap enough hardware. And that means you get a sudden change. And my best guess is that might happen roughly within a century or so. Not right around the corner, but still closer than 2 to 4 centuries, which is why I would suggest it might be more likely. But again, you shouldn't necessarily take my word for that. But that would again be a revolution where suddenly lots of changes all at once. And so there's always the possibility of revolution, but still, we've gone for a long time without a substantial revolution, honestly. I mean, over the last 70 years, we've had many innovations in computer technology and in computer development. Nevertheless, we've had a relatively steady rate at which jobs have been displaced and tasks have been able to be done, and the rate at which computers industry gets paid money, et cetera. Those trends have been pretty steady for 70 years. No revolution in that sense.
So we have the possibility of the slow replacement rate of 200 to 400 years out. We have the possibility of some specific revolutions, which we might not grasp from here yet because they're not obvious, which could speed things up. And then there's the M revolution, where perhaps when we are celebrating the centenary of the Trump presidency, we will be faced with emulations that may correct this all. That's a really, really good answer. That's a really interestingly non-urgent framing for all this.
200 years isn't that far away in the scape of history.
Well, no. I mean, in geological time, it's an eye blink. But if we think of, say, an undergraduate career or a faculty member's tenure or the life cycle of a book, then it's a little further off.
What about the complementary path instead of the replacement path? What if the answer is machines will never replace humans because they don't work like humans, but they will become more and more complementary to things that we don't necessarily do well? I mean, we're already seeing that happening as Google replaces our memory, for instance.
Well, for humans at the moment, the software in your head is tied to the hardware in your head. And the hardware in your head isn't improving substantially over time. And the software is only modestly improving, with our social
It's degrading, actually, over time.
Right. But so we have a very consistent, strong trend for artificial hardware to be improving. So if that doesn't hit a wall and it keeps improving, then it's really hard to see how humans could last in the long run competing with that if we're stuck in the same hardware. Now, the M world is a world where we're no longer stuck in the same hardware. So in the M world, it's much more plausible to imagine emulations lasting compared to other automation indefinitely, at least descendants of them. But for flesh and blood humans like us, it's just harder to see how we could win out in competition against hardware that just continues indefinitely to improve, especially at sort of rates that we've seen in the last half century. That seems a bridge too far to me. But once it's brains like us, software like ours in hardware that's as good as the hardware artificial machines have, then it's more of an open competition, which software is best and which has the longer descendant. And I think I can give you plausible reasons why software like humans might well last a very long time. And therefore, human-like software, people like us who talk like us and think like us, but our machines basically could have a very long legacy.
So we could have that blurring. What a great question, Tom. What a visionary answer. I need to bring Fred into the conversation because Fred Bashairs has been flinging fantastic questions and thoughts in the chat box. And I thought he should do that out loud, where everyone can see his fantastic blue eyes and hear his great voice. Fred, what's your first question?
Well, I lied earlier. I am going to ask an AI question since it's so interesting,
Please.
uh, at some other point, maybe we can talk about my old saw, the British Open University, and how I think the U.S. should create something like that. But for right now, I'm going to come off of our earlier conversation about intelligence augmentation. And an example of where that's happening is after Deep Blue beat the best chess player, they started using advanced chess, where you have teams of AIs working with a human to play other teams. So that's an example of intelligence augmentation. However, that doesn't work in one type of chess, that's speed chess, because there's not enough time for the human to communicate with the computer. So at this point, computers dominate in speed chess at this point. And it may well be that intelligence augmentation works for a while, but eventually the computer simply surpasses what humans can do. And then the question is, what's the nature of the interface between the computer? Since we're mostly talking about education here, I'd like to just go from that to the question I really want to ask, and it's basically phasing in what I'd call digital immortality light and the role higher education might play in this. And digital immortality light is related to something Martine Rothblatt talks about when she talks about mind clones. And in her mind, a mind clone is mindware, some sort of highly sophisticated bot software that can communicate in natural language, plus an extended personality profile, so that bot can simulate you and perhaps pass an extended version of the Turing test where your best loved ones can't tell the difference between the bot and you. And that's science fiction at this point. But educators are currently working on things like extended learner information profiles, virtual tutors that can use those extended personality profile or learner information profiles. And I think in some schools they're looking at intelligent digital assistants. So the work that we're currently doing with virtual tutors, digital assistants, and these extended profiles that we have on people, should we see that as some sort of precursor to what Martine Rothblatt is talking about in terms of mind clones, that ultimately, we should start mind cloning our best faculty, so when they die, we can still have the mind clone of the professor that we can talk to on Shindig. So
I think the right way to think about these things is at the task level. There on any one job, any one person does a great many little tasks, and you can break that down into a really pretty fine detail, all the particular tasks, some of which are being done in parallel that help each other. And it's very clear that tasks complement each other in the sense that typically, in order to get anything done, you need to do a bunch of tasks. And so when humans do some tasks and machines do other tasks, those entities are complementing each other because the tasks complement each other. That is, you need to get several tasks done to get anything done. And I think that's the cause of the fact that it looks like humans and machines complement each other in many ways. But when we look at very fine-grained tasks, we find that typically either a human or a machine is doing that task, and over time, a task could be done by humans and then swapped out, and the machine does that after that, and almost never goes the other direction. And that's one reason to expect it to continue in that direction to eventually do them all. Now, if you ask about imagining some clone of you with a similar personality and videos of your previous behavior, it mimics your behavior. The key question to ask is how many of the tasks you could do could that clone do? If we're talking about something that could do pretty much all the tasks you can do, it's a substitute for you. And then it can be a robot that does everything, basically. And that's a kind of robot that could make a robot world where robots do everything. If you're talking about a kind of clone that can only do a limited range of the tasks you can do, hold a casual conversation with someone else as if they had your memories or something, well, that could substitute for you in those tasks, but not in all the other tasks we need humans for. And so then humans stay important in a world where these clones can only do a limited set of tasks. And so everything hinges on how many tasks these clones can do. And in general, automation, the scope for automation in computers depends on how many tasks these machines can do better than people, or more cheaply or cost effectively.
Yeah, and I'll finish with this question, then I'll shut up and let other people talk. Right now there's a big emphasis on STEM, in higher education, where we want to get more and more students involved in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and so forth. And just to play devil's advocate, it seems like a lot of what goes on with STEM workers is symbolic, things that they don't actually have to have hands and legs and arms and so forth to do. And I think there's something called Moravec's paradox, where the things that are easy, for us to do are actually hard for robots to do. And the things that are hard for us to do, play chess, may turn out to be easy for computers to do. And so I think currently with robot research, robots are still unable to fold towels in any, efficient fashion, right? And so instead of STEM, here I'm playing devil's advocate, instead of STEM, we should encourage students to think about careers that involve folding towels, as opposed to, doing math or
Right.
those sorts of things.
I mean, as an economist, I would just say people should try to do the jobs that pay more. That's the market signal that a job is worth doing well, is how much being's offered for it. And if we could have future markets and future salaries, then that might give you clues about future salaries. So if the market salaries are high today, but look like they'll be low in 10 years, that tells you, well, work on it for a while, but be ready to switch. And we shouldn't be pushing any particular career unless there are substantial externalities, in which case we should just subsidize those jobs. But I don't see much point to pushing people to take a job unless we're willing to pony up and pay them more for it. The salary or the other job amenities should be the main reason you pick a job.
Well, there's your macroeconomics right there. Fred, please, that's a great question. And Robin would another rich answer, but don't go away, Fred. We have Roxanne, and we may allow her to speak if she doesn't have her puppy up. But I'd rather she brings the puppy up if possible.
He's yelling. I hope you don't hear him.
He's fine. He's fine.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm quite entertained right now with a little bit of humor there. My question is about maybe a cohort, Ray Kurzweil, if you are his friends, if you're friendly with him, and your circle of friendships in the AI world, and what are your thoughts with the singularity in the books that he has written, and have you participated in any conferences with Ray?
I've certainly met Ray. I know of him more than he knows of me, I expect. But I would say about him in particular, the impression I get from his books is that he's telling you that every exciting technology trend you've heard of is all going to be happening together faster than you expect, all reaching a crescendo about the same time, which is relatively soon. And so he's predicting a deviation from past trends on a number of technologies simultaneously, so that he doesn't really have to say which of the new technologies is the one that's causing the big change. They're all happening all at the same time. So I'm more willing to just go with past trends and say you should expect roughly in the near future to follow the past trends. You'll have some deviations, but I expect, for example, mortality trends. Mortality has followed a pretty constant age-specific trend over the entire last century in developed countries. Right. It's a very consistent trend, and so I just expect it to continue for another 20 or so years. I don't expect to see the huge revolution in, say, anti-aging technology that Kurzweil might expect, because he needs really big improvements over trend to have the sort of results that he hopes for in the near future. Similarly, for computer automation, et cetera, he and so many others are expecting this huge burst of automation, where some people have said half of all jobs would be automated by 2025 or something like that, and that sounds crazy to me.
Well, my thoughts are with like Elon Musk and the automation of the electric car and the battery car, how quickly that has happened, and many car companies like Mercedes expect to have electric cars. They've given a definitive timeline to get off of fossil fuels, and that's a relatively short timeline. And do you see any leaps in biomedicine, wearable, ingestible pills?
So two kinds of technologies that have been improving substantially recently are batteries, as you mentioned, and solar panels. Mm-hmm. And both of those technology improvements can be roughly forecasted by the principle that the efficiency of a technology tends to go as the power law of the number of units produced so far. So there have been surveys of technologies and hundreds of technologies, and the curve, how the cost curve falls with time. And by the best fit overall of all the technologies is the simple power law function, where the cost of a unit produced goes as the power law of the number of units produced so far. And the solar cells actually follow that trend really nicely. You could have predicted the cost of solar cells now just by following that trend from a decade or two ago. And I know some people, Rama's Nam in particular, who did make those predictions. And I think battery technology is doing the same sort of thing. That is, because there's a burst in units produced of batteries for electric cars, we're getting a burst in the cost falling for the batteries. And those are, again, if you know the right trend that you should be following, these are cases where things are following trends. And so it's not a case for deviation from trend. These are cases of the trend works. And so that's why I would continue to follow the other trends in the other fields. Whatever they are, go with them.
This is fantastic because, among other things, Robin, you've just given the best possible advertising for the FTTE report. I'm so happy. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Roxanne, what fantastic questions. I have please, Fred, go ahead. Jump in, please.
Okay, so it seems like in some respects, economists are boxed in by sort of two groups of thinkers. On the one hand, you have the Kurzweil-like futurists who think that technology is going to save us, and furthermore, it will arrive in a very timely fashion to save us. And on the other hand, we have the Club of Rome buffs, who think we need austerity and we need to, tamp down. We can't rely on economic growth. We can't let the size of the economic pie exceed the size of our finite planet. We're not going to be able, technology is not going to solve those problems. So we're all going to have to be very frugal and very austere. So is there some middle way, do you think, between the Charybdis and Scylla of these two groups?
Well, I read a great book in the last few years called 2052,
61.
I think it was.
Yes.
2052. It was by one of the authors of the Club of Rome, but he's much older and more mature now. And he wrote out his description of the forecast over the next 40 years. And he basically said, these will follow past trends, and he projects the trends forward. And he says, the world is worse off because we won't do enough about global warming, but we will still grow and it'll be okay. He's just, he's giving a middle of the road, decent world that could have been better had we done more about global warming. So that's a Club of Rome author, now 40 years older and wiser, telling you to follow the trends.
I'll just leave you with one quote by my favorite economist, Kenneth Boulding, who once said that anyone who thinks that exponential economic growth can go on forever on a finite planet must either be a madman or an economist.
So, I'll just say that I do not think exponential growth can go on forever at all. I'm a physicist, and I know the physical universe is finite in key important ways, and I could give you roughly an estimate of where that is. But that was true during the farming era. The economy doubled roughly every 1,000 years, much slower than the doubling every 15 years now. But even that growth couldn't have lasted for 1,000,000 years. There wasn't, you couldn't do 1,000 doublings. There wasn't enough space in the universe. So today, doubling every 15 years, you might say we can't go for 15,000 years at the current rate of growth. But that doesn't mean we couldn't grow faster. It would just mean we'd hit the wall sooner. But the universe is still pretty big, so we can still do a lot of doublings. Maybe not 1,000, but maybe 100. And so there can still be a big era of continued exponential growth where a lot of things happen before we hit a wall.
Robin, do you think we really have to build space travel and space exploration for that?
Well, again, eventually we'll run out of Earth.
Right.
And then people will have to go off Earth to get more resources and stuff to grow. Because the universe is vastly larger than Earth, there is a long scope of continuing growth after one runs out of Earth, because the universe is pretty large, but we will run out of Earth. But we are still a long way from running out of Earth. We have many doublings to go before we actually get crowded here on Earth. And there are really strong economic reasons for economic activity to want to be near itself, to be close and clumped. And that will keep us close to Earth and close to other activity for a long time. I don't see much prospect usefully of economic activity off of Earth for quite some time.
So this is fascinating. I mean, among other things, Robin, you're giving us a longer timeline than many people do. Let me just quickly get meta because I'm conscious of time, and I want to remind everybody that if you have questions or comments, again, to use the chat box or click the question so we can flash up the screen. Or as you can see, as with Tom, and Roxanne, and with Fred, join us on stage. It's easy as can be. I'd also like to, if I could, bring the conversation back. It's partly my fault to summon the fate of humanity in the universe. Let's head back towards education again. If we're thinking about these incremental changes with automation and that we've seen for a century, and extrapolate them forward a bit, how is that going to hit technology? Do you think we should be expecting to see better and more often artificial tutors? Are you going to see a revision of the curriculum in order to better account for a gradually, slowly roboticized labor force? Where do you think that's going?
Well, the first thing you have to do when you want to analyze the future of education is you have to have a model of the past of education. You have to ask, what is our best account for what's happened so far, in particular in terms of what exactly is the product and the customers that they've been getting out of it. So, we've noticed that films were possible for over a century, and that meant we could have long had the best lecturers filmed and distributed films of the best lecturers, and that would have presumably been substantially more effective as lectures, and we have not done that for a century, and it's been possible for a century. So that somewhat cuts into the theory that we're really eager to have effective lectures, because we could have done that for a long time. I also, note, both because I think about, I have a colleague, Brian Kaplan, who has a book coming out roughly when my next book comes out. His book is called The Case Against Education. My book is called The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. I have one of my chapters reviewing his book, but there's many ways in which the simple story of education just doesn't fit the facts over what we've been doing for a long time. The simple story of education is that it's about learning the material, and therefore we're eager to find better ways to learn the material. And that just doesn't work very well as an explanation for the fact that we're really focused on credentials rather than learning, that we don't adopt many ways to learn faster that we could, that employers care a lot more, say, about the last year of high school or college than they care about the other years, that people, could get a free education like I did, sitting in on Stanford classes without registering for any classes. Nobody tries to do that, and nobody polices against it. And so basically, learning the material just doesn't seem to be what school is mainly for. We have a bunch of other plausible hypotheses about what it's for, which includes showing off smarts, conscientious conformity, and government indoctrination, learning what our workplace habits, babysitting, dating service, etc. Those are all things that school does seem to function in part to do. And the future of education depends a lot on which of those matters how much. So given how little we've adopted of better technologies for learning in the past, the fact that you might have better automated tutoring systems that doesn't mean anybody will want to use them, because in the past people have already had lots of better ways to learn they haven't used. We already know a lot of things from the education literature for a long time about ways to structure school and ways to structure classes and material so that people could learn faster that they have consistently not adopted. So I would think that I expect, therefore, a lot of the functions of school today are because it's a social process where people meet each other and sit down together and interact and et cetera. Whatever the key part of that is, I expect the social process to continue. And, they'll have to have forums like this with high bandwidth social signals if they are going to substitute for in-person classes. They may well do that, but still, education and universities are actually remarkably stable for centuries. They survived the Industrial Revolution with minor scratches. So they are really stable institutions.
Fred, you don't have to raise your hand. Just jump on in.
Well, I'll just make one point about the history of the British Open University and how things evolved in Great Britain. So in this country, we tend to think that education reform should be a very bottom-up process. And there's a problem with that, and that is that professors do not want to innovate themselves out of a job, yet they have a great deal of political clout in their institution. So they're in a position to thwart technological innovation and change. Now, in Britain, when they decided to create the British Open University, Sir John Daniels, people like that, They did not. They rejected right off the bat the idea of trying to reform Oxford and Cambridge and trying to get them to make an incremental change to be something like the British Open University. That's not what they did. And furthermore, they wanted to have a radically different organizational structure for the British Open University. So it was a very top-down process. The government drove the change and funded it, and top-down planners decided what to do. And contrary to what libertarians think, top-down planning in this particular case seems to have worked very well. The British Open University is a very successful institution. However, the people who create the content are not working on a work-for-hire basis. They are working on a work-for-hire basis. That means that the British Open University owns the content they create. They're sort of like textbook authors who are developing and managing online textbooks as an employee for the British Open University. They have around 300 teaching centers scattered around Great Britain. So they do have a mixture of online and face-to-face education. However, the faculty who work at the teaching centers are subordinated to the senior faculty who work at Milton Keynes, England, who are these content creators. So that is an example of where back in 1969, the government decided to do something in a very top-down fashion. It did it. It created an institution with a radically different organizational structure, and furthermore, it worked. Right.
So what's the criteria for saying it worked?
The criteria for saying it worked.
Yeah, worked at what? What's the
now we get into a long discussion of whether the British Open University has succeeded in fulfilling its mission, and whether or not it's educated students, and whether those students have been able to get jobs. I would say all those things are true. And furthermore, the one other reason why you could say it worked, Margaret Thatcher, who was trying to get rid of the British Health Service and was determined to do that, but didn't succeed. When the Thatcher administration looked at the British Open University, initially they said, government institution, we got to get rid of it. Later on, the Thatcher administration, very conservative, Ronald Reagan-like, decided that the British Open University was doing a good job, and they were the ones that gave up on the idea of trying to get rid of the British Open University. It wasn't because liberal, socialists decided that the British Open University was good and succeeded. Thatcher decided the British Open University was good and decided to leave it in place.
Okay, but
they did a much better job of educating.
One country created a government agency with a budget, and that agency has continued, but the rest of the world hasn't copied this. Most of education, most of the rest of the world continues the way it has. So I'm not sure what exactly the evidence concludes. One agency
for one thing,
to spend its budget the way it had originally authorized. I mean, the British public hasn't killed it.
There's an existence proof, so you can't say that it's never worked anywhere. There's an existence proof where it has worked. And to say that the only way to change things in this country is in a very incremental bottom-up way, which is, complicated immensely by faculty who don't want to innovate themselves out of a job.
It's very hard to tell how ordinary schools work or whether they do. So if I hold myself to the ordinary standards of evaluating standard schools, it's really hard to see that.
We don't know anything about anything. We don't really know
more strong than yours work. Then the
so we don't know anything about how education works or doesn't work. So what is the policy recommendation, and what is the basis for making an induction? We could go back to the whole problem of trying to make inductions.
Let me offer one deduction for a moment, which is that we are almost completely out of time, and the two of you have just hit a stack of enormous subjects, from the question of the epistemology of how we know if education works, to the problem of labor, to the problem of government control, nonprofits, and business. This is a fantastic amount, but I've got to stop it because I'm conscious of people's time, especially yours, Robin. And we had two more questions in the queue that I want to make sure got aired as well. Tara, can you flash up Leslie's question? I think I just saw it. Leslie Harris asks, I'm wondering about the state change model. Is it possible that events will follow a trend until a certain point in which major state change occurs, e.g. climate change? So I think, Leslie, maybe the best example is boiling water, right? Where the temperature rises and rises and rises, then suddenly it boils. Right?
Right. So I mean, I would in fact say, yes, you want to analyze the future as continuing trends until things disrupt the trends, and you want to think about what could disrupt the trend. And so my whole book, The Age of M, is all about saying, well, here's a thing that could disrupt a trend. Let me assume that happens and works out the consequences. And I think it's not the only potential thing that could disrupt trends, and we should be basically iterating, listing all the big things that could disrupt trends that we can think of, and for each one, try to work out the consequences, and that's how we should do futurism. And my book is trying to say, here's a model, follow this model of imagine a big disruptive change and working out the consequences. And so, yes, we should think of a lot more changes and work out their consequences.
That's a good response. Leslie, a fantastic question. I want to make sure that we have time for one last question. I think it was Jonathan from New York who had an AI question. Let me make sure I'm right. Let's see if we can fit it. Jonathan, can you hear us?
Perfect. Can you hear me?
I can hear.
Yes. Welcome.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. Sort of question about the market for AI and for automation. Artificial intelligence. So it's powered by machine learning. Machines learn how to do things like children do. And that in itself produces a network effect. That if your machines, the more your machines learn, the more valuable they are, and potentially the more that they can learn based on how much they've learned already. Just like the human brain does. You learn mathematics, you can learn engineering, then physics and chemistry, and so on and so forth. So I wonder, and I hate to be one of those people that laments big tech, and I'm not lamenting big tech, but I do ask the question that in the market for AI over the next 15 to 20 years, do you think it could become dominated by a few players, such that it's really hard for innovators to find their own niche within the AI market? So let's say Google and Facebook and Amazon, they're the leaders in AI visibly. They're collecting a ton of data that powers their artificial intelligence, such that they're the market winners now. Will they remain the market winners forever?
What you're referring to, economists call a scale economy.
Mm-hmm.
That is a reason why you might want to do things at a larger scale, because the different parts help each other and produce a larger benefit for doing something at a larger scale. At the moment, the largest companies like Facebook and Google are spending disproportionately compared to small tech firms on AI, although it's not clear they're actually getting much economic value out of it compared to how much they're spending. It is in part a PR thing, is they want to be on the whatever's sexy, they want to be in on that, so they seem to be up with the latest, and they want insurance against what if this thing takes off. We don't want to be blindsided, so they're more willing to just buy that insurance. That's different than a network effect of different groups helping each other in a network. So a network effect more happens like between different organizations, et cetera, and a scale economy happens within one. Most organizations are actually not finding enormous benefits from AI at the moment. So the applications of AI are noted to be quite limited at the moment. You actually need really large data sets, which tend to be pretty hard to find. And then you have to actually clean up pretty large data sets, which is very expensive, and people don't tend to do it. So most organizations out there who are trying to use AI at the moment, experts would tell you they don't need AI. They just need a cleaned up database and a simple linear regression or logistic regression or something. And they're just overkill. People are just jumping on it because it's the latest tech. Unfortunately, self-driving cars, even that's the biggest thing that people can point to, but it's, even if that does happen, it's a pretty small fraction of the economy, and it's not necessarily going to justify all the big investments in AI at the moment. And you might have noticed that Warren Buffett, big investor, just made a big investment against self-driving cars. He just bought a big chunk of the Flying J truck stops that supply truckers all over the country, and which is.
I think it's a bit erroneous to use Buffett as justification for anything, because he's been wrong before. He missed out on Apple.
Well, sure, but in terms of track records, he's got one of the best. So,
that's fair, but that's in the 20th century economy. We're in the 21st.
Okay.
Well, we're also out of time. Speaking of stops, I hate to pause you, but I want to respect everybody's time. And Jonathan, what a fantastic question! Thank you, and thank you for jumping in.
Of course.
And Robin, let me just thank you for being a fantastic guest. I mean,
you're most welcome. It's great to chat.
Talking to you reminds me of what it used to be like to be on caffeine. You're much, much faster, and I'm so glad to see it. I hope we can grab you next year at some point, so that you can talk about your new book. And if you want to stick around to talk for another minute, please feel free. Otherwise,
happy to talk to whoever wants to.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you again. Thank you again. Friends, before we go, I need to tell you about a very, very important thing I need your feedback on, which is that we have just launched a survey of the Future Trends Forum. So if you look over here to my right, to the right edge, you'll see a little orange box that says, take our survey. Please do so. It's a survey about how the forum works, about our content, about where we structure things, and we're really, really eager to hear back from you. We haven't done a surveys for more than a year, so it's really important to get that. So just click on it, and I would love to hear what you think. That means a great deal to us. Let me also point you to next week, where we have a guest. We have Satya Nitta, who is from IBM, who works on Watson for education. So we get to continue our theme of automation, the future of education, with another great expert. And on top of that, if you would like to follow up with our book club, we are going to be we're starting to read Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction. So if you haven't read that yet, it's a fantastic book about data. And if you'd like to learn more about Shindig and about the Future Trends Forum and about NGTE, here's a bunch of links you can go to. In the meantime, let me thank everybody, especially Fred, Roxanne, Tom, Michael, Jonathan, all of you guys for fantastic, Leslie, for terrific questions. And we once again thank Robbie for a splendid session. We have a lot to learn. Automation is a deep, deep subject, and I'm glad to think about it with all of you. Until then, see you next week. Bye.